we are going to be, I'm going to introduce the next paper, which is the last paper today, and it's a very welcome one, also because as far as I know, it's the first paper on the subject of Armenian pneumatic notation ever read at the MedRen. As far as I know, there may have been...
Not quite true. Last year.
Not quite true.
And
last year there was one.
Years ago in Prague also.
Okay, then. Okay, I wasn't. Thank you for that, because I obviously last year I couldn't attend, and the year before, and I wasn't in Prague. So okay, Haig Utidjian, PhD, orchestral conductor, chorus master, and musicologist based in Prague, and his native Cyprus. He was a pupil of Archbishop Sarek Aznavourian of blessed memory, and he's a senior deacon of the Armenian Church with research interests in the musicology and theology of the Armenian hymnal and in the works of St. Gregory of Narek. He was recently decorated with the Komitas Medal by the Armenian state and the Jakub Mehapart, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Medal by National Library of Armenia. His publications include the volumes They Who Imbibed the Effusions of the Spirit, The Art of the Armenian Book Through the Ages, Tentisian and the Music of the Armenian Hymnal, and Treasures of the Earliest Christian Nation, Spirituality, Art, and Music in Medieval Armenian Manuscripts. Very much looking forward. Scriptor, Cantor, Notator, the case of the Armenian Neumes.
Thank you so much, Giovanni, for the very kind introduction. And greetings to everyone from Prague. The interrelationships between the respective activities of Scriptor, Cantor, and Notator, and their evolution over time pose tantalizing problems for the still undeciphered Armenian medieval Neumes. This presentation is based on my recent research and is an expanded version of a 3-minute talk I gave at a workshop in November. We know neither the provenance nor vintage of the Armenian Neumes. In such circumstances, of course, having recourse to the earliest extant neumated codices in various genres is particularly significant, although always with the proviso that the absence of earlier preserved witnesses need not preclude the existence of the pneumatic system in earlier periods, albeit unattested in the corpora that have reached us. The question arises why the Neumes ceased to be understood, and this in turn leads us to consider possible developments in the practice of chanting. Well, first, we know that scribes continued faithfully to copy the same numerations, yet successive generations of creative musicians will have surely sought to develop novel melodies, some increasingly melismatic, but in any event melodies that reflected their own evolving tastes and inclinations. There will have thus arisen a growing divergence between the developing melodies on the one hand and the numerations stubbornly preserved, substantially unchanged, on the other. Also, no manuals of instruction comparable, say, to the Byzantine Papadike have reached us, if any ever existed. Catastrophes and relocations, dispersion, and the ransacking of monasteries and destruction of monastic and secular communities have been a constant scourge in Armenian history, and alas, evidently remain so in our own time. A tradition was thus further jeopardized that was already fragile due to its geographical spread, its dynamic and evolving quality, and perhaps the reluctance of specialists to make its secrets available to the uninitiated. So most of the melodies now available to us were transcribed in the 19th century, and we know also that church musicians went on performing whilst gazing at those incomprehensible neumes. How then were the neumes employed in the 19th century? We have some information particularly pertaining to Constantinopolitan practice. The evidence suggests that in the 19th century, singers in Constantinople would derive rough guidance from the Neumes in the following manner, and this applies whether in performing hymns at services in real time or in constructing melodies for the purpose of setting them down in Western staff notation or in the then novel and pneumatic system of notation devised by Limongian that bears his name. So, singers would first inspect the Neumes to assess the appropriate degree of melismaticity on the basis of their density. Next, they would seek to recognize, on the basis of the particular set of Neumes deployed, a type or species within the mode in question, which would be associated with some well-established melody already known to them. This melody could then serve as an implicit model. Singers would notice characteristic sequences on successive syllables and recurring combinations on single syllables of Neumes, and seek to deploy particular motifs or turns of phrase on them with greater or lesser degrees of consistency, that is another lecture unto itself, and convincingly fill out the interstices between those with a certain knack for improvisation, also using memory and an overall knowledge and feel for the mode in question. So deploying standard formulae for various types of opening, cadences, stanza endings, and final hymn endings. Singers would seek to distribute the melody over syllables of text in accordance with perceived metrical durational values, which they apparently associated with syllables bearing particular Neumes or none. This work was done on the basis of the hymnal, but my own research on the odes of St. Gregory of Narek tends to corroborate the hypothesis on metrical values associated with the Neumes in medieval times that we owe the 19th century Constantinopolitan church musician Haig Utidjian, and that work was based on the repertoire of hymns. Returning to odes and my own work, for instance, in the case of the ode by St. Gregory of Narek, Siavem Keretzig, dark am I, comely, nigra sum, sed formosa, if you wish, observing the durational values associated with the Neumes secures regularity of meter despite a lack of uniformity in the number of syllables of text. And moreover, in the one instance where uniformity is not so achieved, we find a bifurcation in the phylogenetic tree representing the verbal text transmission between the extant codices, and I've studied about 30 of those. We may speculate then that the difficulty arose due to a damaged text at some point with which different scribes dealt in their respective ways, some, say, conflating two defective lines, others seeking a different solution, but in any event remaining quite unable to restore the meter. Now, three important points need to be noted. First, it seems that the procedures for performance in real time, as opposed to redaction for the purpose of transcription, were essentially similar, albeit perhaps with greater rigor required in the latter case than in the former. Second, the limited correspondences between melody and Neumes that arose in this manner in 19th century transcriptions were the result of conscious retrospective endeavor on the part of church musicians and redactors in the 19th century. They do not bespeak of any understanding of the original functions of the medieval Neumes. Failure to grasp this point, for instance, led Soviet-era musicologists into unwitting logical circularities and wishful thinking. Thirdly, these semi-improvisatory procedures of 19th century Constantinopolitan singers with their crude use of the neumes, ought not to mislead us into assuming that the pneumatic system, in its fullest sense, necessarily underdetermined the melodies in its medieval heyday. Accordingly, in addition to comparing extant melodies with pneumated sources, of which you can see an example on the right-hand side, there is a strong case for seeking to analyze the neumes on their own terms, jettisoning for the moment what we know of 19th century melodies and practices. There is a substantial degree of uniformity in the numerations of the canonical hymnal, albeit less so with other genres, with a small number of exceptions, and with a certain general loss of precision and care in the manuscript and printed witnesses of more recent centuries. But this could render any deviations all the more interesting and potentially eloquent. In my own pilot studies, involving a mere dozen or so manuscript hymnals, I collated the numerations for a wide variety of hymns. An illustrative fragment may be seen on this slide. It is instructive to consider where variations do occur and, for instance, to attempt to distinguish between meaningful variation and mere error. Hitherto, pilot studies undertaken by hand have revealed a chaotic picture involving a good deal of cross-contamination between sources. So, for instance, a minority reading in one case may be repeated in a second source, which, however, does not reproduce other idiosyncrasies found in the first source, which are in turn reflected in some third source, and so forth. But we might reasonably hope that, if the number of codices were to be substantially increased, a less chaotic and perhaps a more nuanced picture could emerge and clearer patterns be discerned. The degree of complexity of the problem before us would indubitably render access to suitable digital humanities tools useful. Armenian philology does seem to be a couple of steps ahead of musicology in this respect, yet the finest fruits may be attainable when words and neumes can be studied and analyzed in tandem with each other. Furthermore, a vast undeciphered repertoire exists in medieval Armenian chant notation. Such an approach alone could enable a high-throughput approach, one that would involve the exploitation of large amounts of data. And indeed, it is my understanding that just such an approach has already been fruitfully deployed in connection with Hispanic chant. I have been involved in the design of glyphs for the Limongian symbols and in a primitive way for the Armenian medieval neumes. These might be further developed for fundamental research purposes. So what do we need to do? We need to create a multi-genre corpus and iteratively subject it to targeted interrogation to discover more about the structure and flow of melody and its relationship with the words. There may be potential for adopting already existing instruments in pursuit of such investigations. Might the MEI, Music Encoding Initiative, be exploited in connection with the Armenian neumes? And if so, what would then be the desiderata for software for the manipulation of a corpus so transcribed? Now, we know virtually nothing of the properties of the Armenian medieval neumes, whereas in the Hispanic case, some insights, indeed valuable insights, do exist, such as knowledge of the upward or downward direction of movement associated with particular neumes. Again, I believe this fact has been most helpful in enabling rough contours of melodies to emerge. Early in the 20th century, Archimandrite Komitas hoped to decipher the neumes, if I may quote, to cast aside the veil obscuring our most ancient and authentic liturgical music, revealing the original celestial pure melodies, pristine and, as he saw it, untarnished by, and again I quote, Turkish lasciviousness. Giovanni's generation before him had sought to make use of the Neumes as a pedagogical and mnemonic aid, whilst also perhaps seeking to preserve crude correspondences as potential grounds for claiming greater authenticity for one rival melody over another. But both generations remained ignorant of the nature of the system in the medieval era, as sadly does our own. What may now be reasonably expected? The siren call of a vast repertoire of mute items crying out to be quickened, notwithstanding, decipherment of medieval melodies may be beyond our reach. And if that doesn't sound too much like sour grapes to you, one might even suspect that modern ears might perhaps not even necessarily like the medieval melodies that have surely come to be replaced by modern counterparts following the many stages of development, recomposition, and filtration they have doubtless undergone. Yet even a modest improvement in our insight into the original structure of these melodies and an enhanced understanding of their evolution over the centuries would constitute no mean prize. I wish to thank all who have assisted me in my endeavours, as well as the conference organisers, and not least, I thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Haig. Okay.
Giovanni, I think you're freaking out.
I think, sorry?
Forgive me, Giovanni, for a moment you seem to have frozen on my screen, so I did not perceive whatever it is that might
have... Okay, thank you. Thank you, Haig. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you? Okay, any questions from the room or from the chat?
Not at the moment.
Okay, not at the moment. A few years ago, Haig, I got hold of a copy of Utidjian's book, but I never actually had the chance to understand whether what's there. It's largely to be considered as authoritative kind of initial yet authoritative study of Armenian Neumes, or if it's because if I'm not mistaken, it's from the 1950s, I think. So it is a bit sort of an old study in a way. But would you be so kind to tell us whether that remains a reference for the study of Armenian Neumes, especially with regards to the dating of early sources? And I have a question about this after your answer.
One is torn between kindness and sincerity in confronting such a question. We owe Utidjian a huge debt of gratitude for a lot of very good things that he did. But the sort of logical trap to which I referred, whereby people noticed that correspondences could be found between 19th century, indeed late 19th century Constantinopolitan transcriptions, apparent correspondences between particular turns of phrase and groups of neumes, misled Utidjian into thinking joyfully that, so it seems that those musicians still knew something of the medieval system. Whereas, in fact, if you investigate the procedures of those musicians in the 19th century, you find that they openly sought, artificially one might say, although it's not quite an ideal word, but consciously to achieve such correspondences. So he was wrong in that. And in terms of dating, Well, Atayan had unlimited access to the greatest repository of Armenian manuscripts found in the Caucasus, to which, for instance, I don't have access. I have had access to Venice and Vienna and other places. But so his monograph, if used with caution, is very useful because it is a quick way of finding out what sources are available. But as far as dating is concerned, let us recall that this was a kind of Soviet-era nationalist school of musicology, where even daring to venture, say, connections between the practice of Armenian liturgical music and the Byzantine tradition was a sort of treason. So he had a penchant for trying to demonstrate that the Armenian system of Neumes was older than any other and that kind of thing. So again, we are on the other hand, to balance things, we are on the other hand of unfairly dismissing correct things that he did and throwing away the baby with the bathwater. But for example, in order to date the Armenian Neumes, he was reliant on fly leaves that were subsequently used in connection with bindings of later codices. And these fly leaves cannot be reliably dated, but he was hell-bent on claiming that these were really very, very old, and so that proves that the Armenian Neumes are older than other traditions, and so on and so forth. And that kind of work, one cannot be sure if it is correct or necessarily wrong, and it is, of course, very difficult to prove a negative, but I cannot consider it to be reliable. So the book has to be taken with caution. It is still useful in the sense that you can't afford to ignore it. And he did do some good things, but do not take things that he claimed at face value. And after him, others went even to further extremes. There's one other problem with this style of musicology, which is that many of the sources are not readily accessible, and they state certain claims, and you've either got to take it on trust and believe them, or be an agnostic and say that you don't know. But they do not, generally speaking, provide detailed arguments allowing you to choose to disagree at any link of the screen. In my own very modest work, and the Tendesian book, for example, I have given a lot of gory details because you cannot find the sources readily at all. And I want the reader, any reader who may be sufficiently masochistically inclined perhaps, to go through all my arguments. And if they decide that at some stage there's a sort of logical difficulty or an error, then they may be able to disagree at a particular point.
Yes. Well, I mean...
So the Atayan book has to be treated with caution, in answer to your question.
Yes, yes. I think it sounds like a very balanced and very fair assessment. I understand that Yerevan is digitizing more manuscript now. I don't know if I'm wrong, but you know, one hopes that they will be freely accessible in the near future.
May I again respectfully intervene and say Yerevan is quite a large city, and there's more than a single institution there. The National Library of Armenia,
the National Library, yes,
digitizing a lot of extremely valuable early and rare publications, and rendering them freely and readily available to peruse and indeed to download at will, which is something that we owe the enlightened leadership of Dr. Dikran Zarkarian, who until recently was the director of the library, a policy that I trust will continue, and that is a very great blessing. As far as the digitization of manuscripts is concerned, they are, alas, being digitized, and it's another institution that houses those, not the National Library of Armenia, which has a different attitude to the whole matter, with which I strongly disagree. But their own claim is that they're digitizing as a means of preservation, not as a means of dissemination. So if you wish to gain access to a particular hymnal, short of being physically there and going into the building, the only way is you have to order for photographs to be provided of particular pages, but then those codices have not been properly described yet,
Yes.
for the most part anyway. And I don't know how many dollars they're charging now for each, but an Armenian hymnal tends to be anything. I mean, they tend to be tiny things.
Yes,
and that
yes.
means they've got a lot of folio.
Very fat,
So,
yes. Thank you,
you have to be
Haig.
either exceedingly wealthy,
Yes.
or to know someone influential and so on and so forth. Let us hope that this policy will change over time. I'm sure it will, but by that time, I and even your youthful good self may by then have very long white beards and a trembling stick in our hands, but we can continue to hope. But fortunately, other repositories, such as the Mechitarist congregation in San Lazzaro in Venice, or their branch, their monastery in Vienna, and other places also, are far more willing to make researchers from outside those institutions to make their treasures available, because of course study of those materials is highly overdue and of benefit to all, one might have.
Okay, right. Very last question from the chat. Ivan Moody says, Haig, thank you so much for your paper. Would you comment on groups claiming to sing medieval versions of the chant, such as Tarragon? So, briefly.
Well, again, one cannot prove negative, but it is highly unlikely that most of the melodies to which we have access go that far back. The words, in many cases, were composed during Cilician times, the times of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. There was a magnificent flowering of hymnography in the 12th century associated with such people as Saint Narcisse the Gracious, for example. In my view, it would be an illusion, however, to think that when we sing his hymns, using the multiplicity of various melodies that have reached us from different geographical locations, the Venetian tradition, the Constantinopolitan traditions, and so on and so forth. Beautiful as those melodies are, it is unlikely that they would correspond to the Neumesians of the 12th and 13th and 14th century. Now, it may be very helpful if you wish to sell CDs to tourists to claim that you are actually singing melodies composed by Saint Mesrop Mashtots and the holy translators of the 5th century, and such claims are heard, but musicologically they have little substance. But let us stress that the artistic value of the melodies so sung is, in my view, in no way diminished. They may have been transcribed in the 19th century, they may have been sung in the 18th century, conceivably a little earlier. We don't really know. We can use the material we've got and try intelligently to press it into service as a kind of window, as a kind of telescope into the more distant past.
Yes.
But claiming anything more than that is really musicologically unsound. You can claim anything you like. I mean,
of course.
If we decide to go beyond the norms of what is reasonable and justifiable. And I thank Father Ivan for his most penetrating question.
Yes.
I hope that I have succeeded in satisfying him within the confines of our
constraints of our time. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Haig. Thank you very much, everybody, all the speakers and all the attendees, and of course the conference assistants. It's been a pleasure to chair this magnificent, really fascinating session, and enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Giovanni.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Giovanni.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for sharing this.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Dan. Bye-bye.